You have gold, you have everything. If you have gold, you have everything. You can say anything you want. You can do anything you want. If you have gold, you have everything.
Welcome to Innocent Souls in the Hands of the Yellow King. This episode contains spoilers, explicit content, and sensitive topics. Viewer discretion is advised.
I look at the world through a lens of criminology, patterns, broken systems, and the cold mechanics of forensic investigation. When we watch True Detective, I'm not seeing a story. I'm seeing a data set of social disorganization and institutional failures.
And I'm the one who's actually stood on those back roads. I've seen the moss-draped oaks, and I felt the humidity of the places Rust and Marty hunted. I'm here to bring more of a fan's eye view and the reality of the Louisiana landscape to the table here.
And together we're performing a forensic view of the Yellow King case. We're bridging the gap between the haunting fiction you love and the hard science of crime.
Nobody was going to let me make a TV series that was just about two men riding around talking. So I put a murder in there.
Innocent Souls in the Hand of the Yellow King, a post-mortem True Detective Season 1 podcast with hosts spanning decades in the criminal justice system in the South to just regular fans like you and me. With episode breakdowns in relation to the unsolved cold cases of the past millennium, to the psychology of pessimism, self-awareness, and human darkness, where bad men can become heroes, and how one TV show is forever warped in our human consciousness. Perhaps a tragic misstep in our human evolution.
I can see your soul at the edges of your eyes. My family's been here a long, long time. There's something you're gonna have to look at. No other way around it.
This week we hit the 12-year anniversary of the True Detective pilot airing live. I shared a post on Reddit, and to be honest, I wasn't sure if anyone would be listening or if the story still resonated, but the response was overwhelming. We saw over 300 upvotes and dozens of comments from people sharing their own theories, their support, and their excitement for this pilot episode. To everyone who upvoted, commented, or even just took time to read the thread, thank you. You are the reason this pilot is finally hitting the airwaves this week.
It's crazy that a TV show, can be 12 years old and people are still watching it for the first time or rewatching it for the 50th time. And it's hitting them and it's hitting us. And that's kind of why we want to do this podcast right here. And, just the energy from posting just a simple, teaser clip. Use the track from the Black Angels, great band featured on great soundtrack in True Detective, and just some voiceovers of, Russ speaking and then the Yellow King and just keeping that eerie, haunted spookiness. And we're just excited to talk about this. So, 300 plus upvotes on Reddit, we love to see that. But, even if it was just two upvotes, who's ever out there listening, we got the same goal in mind, and it's just talking about one of our favorite TV shows and using backgrounds in criminology and just, backgrounds in psychology and just being a fan. So we'll talk about our personal impact on the show.
I think for myself, watching the pilot live, and I think from looking at the comments, there was a lot of impact from those that saw the pilot live on HBO on Sunday night when it debuted. I was working in criminology in the South at the time, probably about middle way through my career. And the show was just phenomenal, and the impact it had and the authenticity it had in criminology, I was just blown away.
Yeah, it's, and not to date ourselves on how old we may or may not be, but yeah, at the time when that came out, it was like, you just see True Detective, which seems like a pretty standard, okay, something crime, blah, blah, blah. But then you see the cast, you're like, all right, Woody, Matthew, like this could be good. But yeah, that pilot just immediately, how it sets the scene and just, it's, You know, it's like gothic noir meets Criminal Minds and just great acting. And I feel like it was like the peak of television at that time, you know, for HBO specifically. And kind of feel like we took it for granted back then because, you know, to this day, people, it's not even a bold statement to say that this is the best first season on television ever. Yeah, it definitely had an impact on my life, you know, especially as I viewed psychology and was studying psychology at the time. And then just, you know, as we all get older and you kind of like, do we see ourselves as, you know, the young Rust and like the young Woody, you know, like where they're, you know, trying to make do with their careers and their personal lives. And then we, you know, it fast forwards to later in life where both have had, you know, family issues, loneliness issues, you know, just troubled of the mind. Can bad men actually be good men and be heroes? You know, it's always struck me from a psychology standpoint. And just, you know, because every day, whether we study psychology or not, you know, we got brains, we're thinking, we have emotions. You know, this show, it's just, it always strikes a chord with me, you know, in the best way. Pivoting to psychology, you know, then there's criminology. You know, there's a definite crossover there. So,
Right.
you know, if you want to just start talking about like that aspect of criminology and what you experience in the
Right.
field and then from watching the show.
From rewatching the initial pilot this week, just the way that you see Rust work the Dora Lang murder scene is, from a criminologist standpoint, is spot on. From the minute that he puts on his rubber gloves and just starts to tiptoe around the scene, how he moves, what he's looking at, even the textbooks that Rust has in his house were the same ones I studied in college, and I kind of just laughed at the authenticity of the show. And again, I think rewatching the pilot, Rust is taking all that knowledge from the textbooks that he's, for the most part, just organically taking in, and he's already establishing an identification for Dora Lane. And Marty challenges that, you know, basically accuses them of jumping to conclusions and assumptions. And it begins to establish this unspoken organic competition between the two of them that make the show work and make them work together as a team.
Yeah. And I love how you like, you know, you mentioned from your perspective, he's doing everything, you know, it's textbook, pun intended, you know, it's by the book, he's handling it well. And then quickly Russ kind of was like, he's making assumptions. And then Marty is quickly jumping in. So right away we see that morphing of the psychology and like, and the duality of man, you know, between these two somewhat polarizing figures and just how their relationships kind of clash. So tell us about social disorganization theory. I know that was something that, you know, you and I both studied, but how does this kind of relate to the Yellow King in this case?
So, social disorganization theory pretty much explains how the Yellow King was able to operate for decades because the community lacked the collective efficacy to stop him. From a criminologist definition, for the most part, it's like an anatomy of a ghost town. You're able to look at crimes that occur in social disorganization theory, not as a product of individual pathology, but a failure of social institutions. When the community's immune system, the schools, the churches, the local government breaks down, the social control pretty much vanishes.
I love that. Anatomy of a Ghost Town. Just sounds like a book I want to read, or would be a good podcast name, but I'm sure someone took that. So then we got the three pillars of the disorganization. So I'll go 1, 2, 3 real quick here. We got the low socioeconomic status, you know, persistent poverty that drains resources. You know, we see throughout the show, a lot of the interviews, it's with not just drug dealers, but drug addicts, you know, those that are locked up with really not even a dollar to the name. We hear from prostitutes and sex workers, and like they're really going into the community of the lowest of incomes, people doing whatever it takes to survive. So that was a huge impact, especially when you think of geography.
If you get the opportunity, you should kill yourself.
And then number 2, we have residential instability. People moving in and out, people have multiple marriages and partners and kids, and it's like all the family trees kind of, you know, get confusing where like nobody really even knows their own neighbor's name, whether that's for safety or just the fact that so many people are moving all over the place. And just, you know, think of a big theme of the show is missing children. You know, it's just the unknowns and who's really there. And third, you know, one of the third pillars there is the systematic failures within the culture. Thinking of just the churches, law enforcement, school systems, natural disasters. You think New Orleans, Louisiana, many disasters from, Katrina all the way back to Hurricane Andrew and how that affect, the South.
And I'm thinking through numerous rewatches and listening to numerous podcasts that Pizzolatto has done since the inception. He's created this universe that's a masterclass in the Southern Gothic noir. He's moved away from this postcard virgin image of the South instead of focusing on the eco side, the aesthetics, where you have these massive industrial refineries that loom over these vanishing, impoverished landscapes. It's this intersection of industry and rural areas and the people that kind of entwined into that dissection. The setting, for the most part, serves as a physical manifestation of social disorganization theory. It's a world being consumed from the inside out, where the humidity and the decay systems aren't just atmosphere, but they're actually active participants in the institutional failures that allow the Yellow King to vanish into the long grass of the bayou.
Nice, man. No, good stuff there. Yeah, like I said, getting to experience, the lay of the land there, where they filmed and the geography, there was so much more than just a setting.
Right.
I'll never forget that feeling that I had. It was in my stomach. It was like butterflies. Going to that plantation where the sign that said, "No trespassing." You could get shot. And just that rush I had, just breaking that law right there, breaking and entering there, trespassing, if you will, and just driving and following the weird maps I found, through Reddit and through old online message boards of how to find the Doorlang tree, and then just finally pulling up to it. I really felt something there. Just to be at that tree and just, where our favorite show, just where it all began. It was a beautiful moment. I'll never forget it. And, another chilling part was just kind of the reality where, Pizzolatto and the Yellow King, it was kind of relating to, Louisiana, it's got a dark history, right? And in a future episode, we're going to talk specifically about the 2005 Hosanna Church scandal, which I feel like hasn't been covered too much, in every other true crime pod. But, that's a future episode. So like I said, it's not just going to be a true detective here, but just a lot of kind of the real life scenarios and the real life tragedies and the dark history we'll be covering. More on that, it's just the data set of just a failed society where the community's, quote, immune system, right? It's schools, local law enforcement, just the social guardianship had entirely atrophied, right? Leaving the most vulnerable, quote, innocent souls, right? Where the podcast's name comes from, really as they pray for a monster just hiding in plain sight.
My family's been here a long, long time.
So I want to pivot here to a big theme of the show, and that's the concept of time. So there's 3 dimensions of time within True Detective. We have the lost years from 95 up to 2002, the good times slipping away, right? So during the initial investigation, both detectives, they're focused on the wrong things. Years are slipping by. What's actually going to be it? There's distractions. We got Marty claiming to be a family man, obviously doing the opposite of that. We'll call them extracurricular affairs. Just kind of maintaining that facade of, being a domestic family man, right? And by the time he realizes, what he has, his daughters, they're long grown by then. His marriage, pretty much he can't come back from that.
I was gonna play baseball, ride bulls. You end up becoming something you never intended. I guess you never really even know why.
I suppose I could have been a painter, historian. Old scenes, new details.
Then we got Rust and Rust's own obsessions, really being that lonely guy, being trapped inside, just focusing so intensely on the darkness of the case that he pretty much remains frozen in his own grief. He's unable to move past the death of his daughter. Now, we never meet his daughter in the show, but we quickly learn that He suffered an immense trauma, as a very young father. And that's something that he keeps with him throughout. And, some could say that's motivation for him to find the missing children. If he couldn't save his own daughter, maybe he could save someone else's. So the result of that, it's like we're looking at the world through the lens of these two different egos. We have got vices, we've got deeper conspiracies, killing, Reggie Ledoux and declaring it, all right, case closed, that's it. Only to realize a decade later that, this monster was still among us, still among the woods, within the bayou, all over the place. Then we get to the flat circle, everyone's favorite quote of the flat circle in 2012.
Someone once told me time is a flat circle.
Philosophy of reoccurrence. This is the idea that everything we have done or will do, we will do over and over again. You can think of that relationship-wise, work-wise, just all of life. People have deja vu. It's like everything is just coming over and over again, which leads us to the trap. So I'll pivot to you on this one to talk kind of criminal justice system within this.
In the criminal justice system, this manifests as the same crimes, the same victims, and the same institutional failures repeating in perpetuity. Rust realized that there's victory and that 1995 was an illusion, the single point on the circle they're forced to walk on again. And I think for the most part, Rust is almost like frozen in time from the death of his daughter. And for the most part, the two detectives, when they begin to quote unquote interrogate him in the pilot episode, the minute they ask him about the Dora Lane case, he clicks in as if he's in real time in 1995, reoccurring every single detail through the narrative. And again, it's that concept of time that we're jumping between different timelines and how the two characters are affected. That just makes the show lightning in a bottle.
Awesome. I like that quote. And, then lastly, we got the locked room analogy. So Rust describes, all of our lives as a locked room, viewing human consciousness as a tragic misstep in evolution, which is one of my favorite quotes.
I think human consciousness is a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from itself. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law.
We are beings who believe we are individuals with, quote, souls, but we were actually just biological matter caught in a loop. Now, that existentialism, that always spoke to me. When I think of myself as a Rust-like character, it's just that, it's like that obsession of nothingness and existentialism. And that's really what Rust, hits with the human consciousness quote there. And then we get the closed loop, right? So Rust suggests that from a higher dimension, our entire lives would look like a flattened singular object. To Rust, really, the only way to close this analogy is to recognize the futility of the struggle. Yet then he, which is ironic, is the only one who keeps fighting to break this loop by finally solving the case for real in the finale. So as our podcast, if we have our first season of the pod covering the first season of the show, we'll get to all that. But just that concept of time there, it's an important theme, throughout the show, obviously, and then throughout this podcast as we encourage everyone, rewatch the series and have this podcast as a little companion.
And even for my rewatch this week of the pilot, from the opening sequence, you have the 2012 timestamp when the camera goes on and hits record of Marty in the interrogation room. And then, through that procedural part of it, you see Rust in that same room, haggard, drinking Lone Star, talking about flat circles. And the two detectives, for the most part, are thinking he's just out of it on a bender and a blackout. When for the most part, it's an analogy that makes you realize that time didn't really heal these two men. It just gave them and gave their own trauma more time to breathe. And we're not really watching a case or watching the wreckage of a 20-year haunting.
World needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door.
The duality of man, right? We talk good men, bad men. We see many of the characters, even the most likable of characters, when you think of a Rust or a Marty. I always think Rust is more likable. But if you think of how likable Rust is, how flawed he is, how obsessive and sad he can be, but then he can be motivational. And then right when you think like, oh, he's he's the man. I want to be like him. He shows up hammered, to Marty's house, bringing the flowers. And then it's like you see that other side of him. It's like, oh, okay, is that alcoholism? Is that addiction? Is that just him compensating for something else? And then we kind of learn, what was it? That was the day of his daughter's birthday,
Yeah.
right? Who had
Yeah.
passed. So it's like, and Marty doesn't know that. And then we find out where Maggie knew that. And what's the quote? Maggie asks, like, do you ever really ask him anything, or do you
Right.
just kind of
Yeah.
work with him? So I think
Yeah.
there's that dynamic of they're coworkers, sure. But when you're talking life and death in cases like this, it's so much more than a job. And I think that's where Maggie kind of sees into Rust a little more. She obviously sees Marty. She knows all of his bullshit. He can't get away with that. But when Maggie sees Rust and Marty doesn't, it's interesting how Maggie has such little crossover where Marty sees him all day. And it's like, he wants that silent reflection, right? He doesn't want to hear Rust's bullshit until he does, when they reconnect later, 2012 and whatnot.
I think what makes the show timeless is, over the last 12 years, the number of people that come out and say, I'm Russ Cole, or I relate to Russ Cole. When the actual show launched, it was like, who is this guy and what is he talking about? Flat circle. Nobody really understood just the depths of that character. And on the surface, you see the Marty Hart, even the last name Hart and the name Rust. If you want to look at how Pizzolatto actually created those, the names of the characters, I mean, it pretty much goes that deep. And then during the rewatch, for the most part, you see season 1 starting off with Marty asking himself if he's a bad man. And Russ basically trying to convince him, look, the world needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door, so kind of get over it. Russ later on admits that he killed the suspect on the job, while Marty never fired his gun. Even Marty's daughter has asked Russ at the dinner table if he's killed anyone, and he admits it and says yes to the 2 children.
You shot people?
Macy.
Dad's never shot anybody.
Oh, that's good. You don't want to shoot people.
But you have.
Later on, we obviously see Marty kill the regular dude. And I think for the most part, that is the transformation of Marty realizing maybe I'm a bad man and just need to accept it. And even Russ, after the shooting, Marty's initial reaction is, Russ, what do we do? And Russ' comment is, fuck him. We got to make this look right. And that, for the most part, is just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And we later hear Maggie say, I've always seen Russ to be a good man, where she pretty much is convinced that Marty is a bad man. And then obviously we'll talk about how the season kind of wraps up between both of them later on in the pod series. But the duality in the show overall is just amazing, and how it's represented and how it foreshadows through the 3 times dimensions that are shown.
Well said. I love that quote when he's just like, fuck them. Let's make this look right. And then it's like, now they're clicking, right? Now we see the teamwork of, okay, I got your back. You clearly have my back. Now that was such a powerful scene. One of my best favorite scenes in television was the whole Reggie Ledoux build up, and you see that freaky figure from afar with like the weird tattoos. He's got his shirt off, and you just know, you think right then and there, I'm like, oh, this is it.
Right.
This is who the awful man is, but it's just, one of many other awful men, that we'll be exploring here in the pod. So let's wrap up here. Episode 1. Thank you again, everyone, for listening. Follow us on Spotify. That's the best way to get updates when the show comes out. But we'll also be sure to, bother you guys and give you little reminders on Reddit and whatnot. So the trail here, it's really just starting to get cold. The shadows, they're getting longer. Next week, we've got homework, and that's to rewatch episode 2 called Seeing Things, where we move from the crime scene into the friends of Dorothy and the first real whispers of Carcosa. Just some good advice. Don't go into the long grass alone, because some things in the woods aren't meant to be found.
And I'll be bringing the data to the darkness. I'll be dissecting how Russ Cole develops the initial profile of the Yellow King, and how he uses social invisibility as his primary cover. Until then, keep your eyes on the data, because the data never blinks.